When I was going through my late husband's woodworking shed 3 weeks after the funeral, I found a coffee tin on the highest shelf, behind the Danish oil and the sandpaper. Inside the tin was a folded piece of paper, a small silver key, and a note in his handwriting that said, "Find the gray lockbox under the workbench. Open it alone. Do not tell Bethany." I stood there with sawdust on my shoes and read that sentence 4 times. Do not tell Bethany. Bethany is our daughter. My name is Wanda June Hargrove, and I am 71 years old. I spent 46 years married to a man named Earl, who built furniture in his spare time and kept his feelings in his chest like a man who believed that saying things out loud made them more real than he wanted them to be. He was not cold, he was careful. There is a difference, and it took me most of those 46 years to understand. We raised our daughter in a brick house on Caldwell Lane in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we watched her grow into a woman who was sharp and efficient and married a man named Preston who was exactly the same way, only louder about it. Earl died in October. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in June, gone by the time the leaves were fully down. 4 months from the word cancer to the folded flag on my mantelpiece. That is how fast it went. People say things like at least it was quick, and I understand what they mean, and I also want to tell them that quick is not the same as gentle. After the memorial, after the casseroles and the cards and the particular silence that moves into a house once the people have gone home, I began to do what widows do. I sorted, I organized, I made lists of what to keep and what to give away, and I stood in doorways for long stretches, not knowing what I had come for. The shed was the last place I went. See, in 1998, 12 by 16 feet, cedar siding, a workbench along the back wall, pegboard for his tools. He had been meticulous in there in a way he was not always meticulous elsewhere. Everything had a place. Every tool hung in its outlined space, like something in a museum. I had been putting off the shed because it smelled like him, pine shavings and linseed oil, and something underneath that was just Earl, the way spaces absorb the people who spend time in them. I found the coffee tin on a Thursday afternoon in November on the top shelf, behind a row of finishing supplies. My first thought was that it was just hardware, spare bolts or cabinet hinges, the kind of small useful things Earl tucked away everywhere. But it was too light for hardware, and when I lifted the lid, there was the note. Find the gray lockbox under the workbench. Open it alone. Do not tell Bethany. The lockbox was where he said it would be, pushed to the back wall, beneath the lower shelf. Gray metal, the size of a shoebox, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. The silver key fit. Inside was a letter, 8 pages, handwritten on the yellow legal pad paper Earl had always preferred, and a manila envelope that was sealed and heavy with whatever was inside it. I sat down on his work stool, which was too tall for me, and always had been, and I read the letter. By the time I finished, I had to read it again to be sure I had understood it correctly. Earl had discovered, 14 months before he died, before the diagnosis, before any of it, that Bethany and Preston had been systematically refinancing the equity out of our vacation property, a small lake house in Rockingham County that Earl's parents had left to him in 1991. The lake house was in Earl's name. Preston, who worked in commercial lending and understood better than most people how paperwork moves, had presented Earl with what he described as a tax optimization document during a family visit 2 summers ago. Earl had signed it. He had trusted his son-in-law. He had also, he wrote in the letter, not read it carefully enough, which was not like him, but he had been tired, and Preston had been explaining it at the kitchen table after Sunday dinner. And Bethany had been nearby nodding in that way she had. That meant this is already decided, Dad. What Earl had signed was not a tax document. It was the first in a series of instruments that restructured the lake house into a joint asset, giving Preston co-signatory authority, which Preston had then used to take out a home equity line of credit against the property for $140,000. The funds had been drawn in 4 installments and deposited into an account that did not include Earl's name or mine. Earl had found this out by accident. He wrote, when he received a statement for the equity line in the mail, addressed to him as co-borrower for a loan he did not remember authorizing. He had not confronted them. He had been too stunned at first, and then too sick, and then too afraid of what it would do to me if he told me while he was still alive, and I had to carry it alongside watching him die. That was Earl's reasoning, and it was exactly the kind of reasoning that made me love him and want to shake him in equal measure, because he was wrong, and he knew he was wrong, and he said so in the letter. I should have told you. I was trying to protect you, and I was protecting the wrong thing. I'm sorry, Wanda. I'm sorry. I waited. The manila envelope held documentation. Bank statement, a copy of the original instrument Earl had signed, with a typed explanation from an attorney friend Earl had quietly consulted 18 months ago, annotating exactly how the language had been structured to obscure its true purpose. Printed screenshots of the equity line draw history, a short handwritten note from Earl's attorney friend that said simply, "These transfers were not authorized in any meaningful legal sense. She has a case. He had left this for me. He had built the whole thing knowing he would not be there to hand it to me himself." I sat in that shed for nearly an hour. Outside, the November light was doing its early disappearing act, going gray at the edges before 4 o'clock. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street in an ordinary way that seemed very far from what I was holding in my hands. When I came back inside, I set the lockbox on the kitchen table. I did not call Bethany. I did not call Preston. I made a cup of tea I barely touched, and I sat with the question of what I was going to do about the fact that my daughter had watched her father sign a document under false pretenses and had said nothing, had nodded, had let it happen. Had been, I realized, the one who had suggested the kitchen table on a Sunday after dinner when Earl was tired and trusting. The call from Bethany came 2 days later. She called every Sunday, usually in the early afternoon, and the call was generally pleasant and general, the kind of conversation that covers a lot of surface without going anywhere deep. This Sunday was different. She asked, as she sometimes did, whether I had gotten to the shed yet. Then she asked whether Earl had left anything in there she should know about, whether there were any financial documents mixed in with his things. I said I was still sorting. There was a pause that told me everything. "Of course," she said. "No rush, but if you do come across anything related to the lake house, Preston can help you figure out what to do with it. He understands all that paperwork better than anyone." I told her I would let her know. I had not slept well the 2 nights before that phone call, and I did not sleep well the night after it either. I lay in the bed where Earl had slept beside me for 46 years, and I thought about my daughter, who I had raised to be honest, and whether the person she was now was something embassy that had happened to gradually or all at once, and whether it made a difference. On Monday morning, I made an appointment with a woman named Denise Quarles, an estate and property attorney who had been recommended by my friend Ruth Ann, who had dealt with her own probate complications after her mother passed, and had described Denise as someone who did not soften things unnecessarily, which is what I needed. Denise Quarles had short natural hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the organized stillness of a person who had heard a great many difficult things and knew how to hold them. I laid everything on her desk. The letter, the manila envelope, the annotated legal analysis Earl's attorney friend had prepared. She read without speaking. When she finished, she looked at me. "What is your goal?" she asked. "I want the lake house to be what it was supposed to be," I said. Earl's parents built that property. It was meant to come to me. It was not meant to fund whatever they needed $140,000 for. She nodded, capped her pen, and said, "That's achievable." I drove home, feeling something I had not felt in 6 weeks. Not happiness, something more structural than happiness, like a floor that had been uncertain and was now solid again under my feet. Bethany called again on Wednesday. This time her voice had a new quality to it, a careful attentiveness that was different from her usual efficient warmth. She mentioned that Preston had been thinking about the lake house, about whether it made sense for me to hold on to it now that Earl was gone, whether the maintenance would be too much. She said they'd be happy to take it off my hands, handle the sale themselves, make sure I got a fair price. She said the word fair twice. I told her I wasn't ready to make any decisions. The shift in Bethany after that was subtle, but I had been her mother for 44 years, and I knew her. She had always been the kind of person who got quiet when she was thinking and went busy when she was worried. She stopped calling on Sundays. She texted instead, short messages about nothing, which was her way of keeping a line of communication open without having a conversation that might go somewhere she wasn't prepared for. Preston emailed me 2 weeks later. The email was professional in tone, almost formal, as though he had drafted it more than once. He explained that there may have been some confusion about the nature of the Lake House equity arrangement, that Earl had understood the purpose of the funds, that the money had been used for things that benefited the family, specifically 2 years of private school tuition for their youngest that they had not had the liquidity to cover otherwise. The family. Their child's tuition, drawn from a property that belonged to Earl's parents before it belonged to Earl and would have belonged to me. I forwarded the email to Denise without responding. She filed the first motions within the week. A formal challenge to the equity line on the grounds of misrepresentation and unauthorized use of authority, and a request for a full accounting of the draw history and the current disposition of the funds. I told Ruth Ann everything on a Saturday afternoon when she came over for coffee, because keeping it inside had started to feel like holding something that had weight. She sat at my kitchen table and listened the way Ruth Ann always listened, with her full attention and without interrupting, and when I finished, she set down her cup and said, "Preston always reminded me of someone counting the furniture while he was talking to you." I knew what she meant. I had always known, somewhere below the place where I was willing to say things out loud. The formal response from Bethany and Preston's attorney came 3 weeks after Denise filed. It was a request for mediation rather than litigation, which Denise said told her they had looked at the documentation and understood that what they were holding was not a strong position. The mediation offer included a repayment proposal, $60,000, to be structured as a family loan forgiveness in exchange for my withdrawal of the formal proceedings and my agreement not to pursue further action related to the Lake House property. $60,000 against $140,000 taken, against a property that had been in Earl's family since before Bethany was born. I did not accept the offer. I told Denise to respond that I would see them in court. 3 days later, Bethany came to the house. She came alone, without Preston, which surprised me. She stood at the front door in a dark coat, and she looked tired in a way she had not looked at the funeral, and I thought, she has been carrying this longer than I realized. I let her in. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, and for a moment it was almost ordinary. Then she said, "Mom, you have to understand what things were like. When Bo needed that school, when we needed the money, Preston said it was fine, that Dad had agreed, that it was basically already going to be ours someday anyway." I let her finish. "He told you that," I said. She looked at her hands. "He said they had talked it through." "Did you see any paperwork showing that?" I asked. "Any written agreement? Any communication where your father said, 'Yes, take $140,000 for my parents' lake house property'?" She was quiet. "Did you ask?" I said. The quiet that followed was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of a person who had asked that question of herself many times in the dark and had not liked the answer. "I didn't want to ask," she said finally, in a voice that was small in a way Bethany's voice almost never was. "Because if I asked, I'd have to know." I sat with that for a moment. "I know," I said. "I know that's true. And I also need you to understand that choosing not to know is still a choice. Your father signed something he didn't fully understand at a kitchen table on a Sunday when he was tired. You were there. You watched him sign it. That is something you are going to have to live with, Bethany, and I cannot carry it for you." She cried then, which I had expected. She said she was sorry, which I believed, and which was also not enough, or not the right kind of enough, not yet. I handed her a box of tissues and told her I loved her and also that I would be proceeding with the case. She left an hour later. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, and I stood at the front window for a while afterward, my hand on the curtain, looking at the empty street. The hearing was in February, which felt appropriate. Earl had loved February least of all the months. He always said it was the month that didn't know what it wanted to be. Standing in a courtroom in February with Earl's documentation laid out on a table felt like exactly the kind of thing he would have both hated and quietly approved of. Denise had prepared me thoroughly. We had gone over the documents so many times I could have recited the draw dates in my sleep. She had told me what to expect from Preston's attorney, a man named Cliff Ware, who handled commercial real estate disputes, and who would, she predicted, attempt to reframe the entire matter as a family financial arrangement made in good faith. He did exactly that. He was polished and unhurried, and he used the phrase informal family understanding 4 times in his opening. He spoke of Earl's relationship with Preston as collaborative and trusting. He implied, without saying it directly, that a 71-year-old widow misunderstanding a complex financial instrument was more probable than a son-in-law deliberately obscuring one. Denise's opening took 11 minutes. She presented the draw history, the original instrument, the annotated legal analysis, and 3 specific provisions of North Carolina property law that the equity line arrangement had violated. She did not editorialize. She did not perform outrage. She let the paper speak. The judge was a man in his 60s with a deliberate manner who wrote steadily throughout both openings. He asked questions that were specific and technical, which told me he had done his reading. When he asked Cliff Ware to explain the authorization chain for the second and third draws, Ware's answer took 4 minutes and arrived nowhere useful. When Denise asked Preston, under oath, to identify the specific date and location of the conversation in which Earl had explicitly agreed to the equity line, Preston said he didn't recall the exact date. Denise asked about the location. He said he believed it was at our house. Denise asked whether anyone else had been present. Bethany, he said. Denise then asked Bethany, who had been called separately, the same question. Was she present for a conversation in which Earl explicitly agreed to the equity line? Bethany said, I was there when they discussed it. Denise asked, and did Earl say in that conversation that he agreed to borrow $140,000 against the lake house property? There was a silence. He said he understood what Preston was explaining, Bethany said. That is not an agreement, Denise said. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need punctuation. The ruling came 5 weeks later. Full restoration of the equity line balance to Earl's estate, $140,000 plus accrued interest, plus my legal costs. The court also found sufficient grounds for a referral to the North Carolina State Bar's Ethics Division regarding the original instrument, which had been drafted by a notary in Preston's professional network, whose involvement, the judge noted, warranted independent review. I was sitting in Denise's office when her assistant brought the ruling in. Denise read it in the way she read everything, without expression, until she had finished, and then she looked up and said, You won, completely. I nodded. I noticed my hands, resting on my knees, were entirely still. I had not expected to feel uncomplicated relief. I did not. What I felt was closer to what Earl must have felt when he finished a piece of furniture that had given him trouble. A satisfaction that was mostly quiet, with something sad underneath it, because the thing that made it necessary should never have been necessary. He documented it the way he built things, I told Denise. She had said something similar when she first reviewed the manila envelope. Your husband was thorough, she had said. He gave you everything you needed. He just waited until he couldn't wait any longer to give it to you. He had been afraid, I said, of the same things I was afraid of. She looked at me. You weren't, though, she said. In the end. I thought about that on the drive home. Whether what I had been was brave, or whether I had simply been so angry on Earl's behalf that fear had not had much room to operate. I was not sure there was a clean distinction. I called Ruth Ann from the car. She said, I knew it. Then she said, come over. And I did, and we sat on her porch even though February was still February, with blankets over our knees. And she opened a bottle of wine she said she'd been saving for the right occasion. And that was enough. The lake house stayed mine. I drove out to see it in March, the first time since the previous summer, when Earl had still been able to make the drive, and we had sat on the dock and watched the water and talked about the osprey that nested in the pine across the cove. The dock was still there. The pine was still there. The osprey would come back when the weather warmed. I sat on the dock for a long time. The water was cold and flat and particular to itself, the way water in early spring is, not quite believing in warmth yet. Earl had loved this place with the specific love of someone who has been given something they know they don't entirely deserve, which is how he had felt about his parents' generosity in general. He had taken care of things they gave him the way he took care of everything, carefully, quietly, over a long time. I had taken care of this too, for him and for the version of us that had sat on this dock for 30 years and had not known yet how it would end. Bethany did not contest the ruling. She and Preston moved to Charlotte in the spring. I heard this through a cousin, not directly. The ethics referral regarding the notary was, as far as I know, still under review. Preston's career was his problem. Whether their marriage survived what had been required to pay back $140,000 in 90 days was not something I was kept informed of. Bethany called me in April. It was a short call. She said she was sorry again, and this time the word had more weight behind it, the kind of weight that comes from having had to do something concrete to demonstrate the meaning of a word. She did not ask for anything. She did not explain herself further. She just said she was sorry and that she hoped I was okay. I told her I was. I told her also that I hoped she was okay, and I meant it, and she knew I meant it, because I was her mother, and she had known me for 44 years, and she knew the difference between things I said and things I meant. She said, "I knew it was wrong." "I know," I said. "That matters. We did not make plans. But we left the door open, which was more than I had been certain of some days." My grandson called me in May. He was 15, Bethany's oldest, a quiet boy named Wade, who had always been more interested in the natural world than in the human one, which I had always thought was evidence of good judgment. He wanted to know if he could come stay at the lake house for part of the summer. "Just a week," he said. "I want to see if the osprey nest again." I told him yes. I told him to bring rubber boots because the path to the north side of the dock gets muddy after rain. He said, "Grandma, did you actually fight for the lake house?" I said, "I did." He was quiet for a moment, the thoughtful quiet of a 15-year-old turning something over. Then he said, "Good. That was enough. That was more than enough. Earl's tools are still in the shed, still hanging in their outlined spaces. I go in there sometimes on weekend mornings with a cup of coffee, and I just stand there, and I smell the pine and the linseed oil, and I think about a man who built things carefully and quietly over a long time, who was afraid of the wrong things too late, and who loved me well enough to leave me everything I needed to take care of myself when he no longer could. I never found a way to be angry at him for waiting. I tried, once or twice, in the dark in the early months. But the truth was that what he did in that shed, all those months while he was sick and frightened and losing weight, sitting at his workbench not building anything but building a case, carefully, methodically, the way he did everything, that was its own kind of love letter. I keep the coffee tin on my kitchen windowsill now, empty. Earl would have found somewhere more logical to put it. But I am not Earl, and the kitchen windowsill is where things go when I want to see them every day. The osprey did come back. Wade and I watched them from the dock on a Thursday in late June, the pair of them working the nest across the cove with the focused patience of creatures who know exactly what they are doing. Wade had a pair of binoculars. He narrated quietly, under his breath, not for me but for himself, and I sat beside him in the morning light and thought, this is what things are supposed to look like when they return to where they belong.